This is Canada Reads American Style, featuring two friends who love Canada Reads and Canadian literature. Welcome our host Rebecca from Michigan and Tara from Ontario. Hi everyone, it is Rebecca, and today I am speaking with author Leslie Shimotakahara. Leslie's third novel, Sisters of the Spruce, is on Quill and Quire's 2024 Spring Preview for Fiction, and the 49th Shelf's most anticipated, our 2024 Spring Fiction Preview. Her memoir, The Reading List, won the Canada-Japan Literary Prize and has been translated into Japanese, and her fiction has been shortlisted for the K.M. Hunter Artist Award. She has written two other critically acclaimed novels, After the Bloom and Red Oblivion. Leslie's writing has appeared in the National Post, World Literature Today, and Changing the Face of Canadian Literature, among other anthologies and periodicals. She completed a PhD in English at Brown University, after which she returned to her hometown of Toronto, where she now resides with her husband. Welcome, Leslie.
Thank you so much for having me.
As I was saying to you just a few seconds ago, your publicist or publisher reached out and asked if I wanted to read this book. And as soon as I saw the subject matter, it sounded fantastic. So I said yes. I received an e-copy. So this is for my full transparency for everyone. But I will say that I really only interview people whose books I really, really loved. And so I'm thrilled to have you here to talk about Sisters of the Spruce.
I'm delighted to hear that. Thanks, Rebecca.
Sure. Now, can you tell us, for those who have yet to read it, can you tell us a little bit about Sisters of the Spruce?
This is a novel that is set during the First World War on the Queen Charlotte Islands, which are now called Haida Gwaii. And it was during this time that these remote islands in northern British Columbia were in the early stage of being opened up to the world due to the Allies' campaign to acquire Sitka spruce trees for their fighter planes in Europe. It's worth mentioning that Sitka spruces are trees of enormous scale and durability, and they were considered virtually bulletproof by the standards of the day, and therefore were ideal for military aircraft. And the Queen Charlotte Islands was one of the few places in North America where these trees grew. So, yeah, at the beginning of my novel, in the first chapter, my heroine, 14-year-old Kaya Terada, who is Japanese Canadian, arrives with her parents and two sisters on the Queen Charlotte Islands as dusk is falling. And they're met by a kind of crotchety white man who works for the logging company that's hired them. And he takes them on a long boat ride, helmed by an indigenous skipper, down a dark strait to the inlet that contains Buckley Bay, where they're going to be stationed. And the camp here is skeletal. It's in its very early phases, and it becomes clear that getting the cabins and the mill built will be among Kaya's father's first tasks as he assumes a leadership position in camp life, and more workers start to arrive. But fairly quickly, it becomes clear that jealousy and racial tensions, primarily between the white and Asian workers, ignite when some white loggers become very envious of the leadership position that Kaya's father's been elevated to. And then from there, my novel explores the devastating consequences of this rivalry, as Kaya's older sister Izumi, Izzy for short, is really the one that bears the brunt of it.
Yeah, that part of the story it just rang so true. It just felt, I mean, you could feel the emotion of all of that, but I don't want to give away too much too, because I like people to discover on their own. But I'm kind of curious what prompted you to write the story, and also when did you start researching and writing it, and kind of how your research process works.
I had a strong desire to write a novel that is inspired by my grandmother's really vivid stories that she told me about growing up on Haida Gwaii in the 1920s. My grandmother, who lived until 101, was a very vivid storyteller. And I think this was really her favorite phase of her life to talk about. Her father, my great grandfather, had moved the family there from Prince Rupert around 1920 when he was offered a position at as a foreman at a mill there. So, in the course of my research about the history of what was taking place in that region, that was how I stumbled upon the story of the Allies' campaign to acquire Sitka spruce trees. And so, even though my grandmother, she'd actually been there during the 1920s after that phase, it just seemed to offer such unique and interesting material for a novel. So, I decided to situate my novel during the First World War. And yeah, as for my research process and writing process, I think I began working on this novel around 2018. And then during the pandemic years, I was working on it. And there was quite a bit of research that went into it. One of the documents that was really of value to me was actually a diary that was kept by my great grandfather, Sanosuke Enyu, when he first immigrated to BC, British Columbia, from Japan in the mid 1890s. And he'd been working in the logging and fishing trade around the Skeena River and other parts of northern BC in his 20s. And so, even though in my novel he's close to 50, so it's a much later phase of his life, this diary, which a couple of cousins of my mother's had translated over the past several years, that was quite a big undertaking because the diary is written in a more archaic form of Japanese. It was some messy handwriting, but it was very illuminating in terms of just sort of giving me a glimpse into his personality and who he was as a young man. And then, yeah, other research sources that were of value to me that stand out in my mind. There were many books that I read over the years I was working on this, but one of them is From Slave Girls to Salvation, which is a book on the history of the Chinese rescue home, which was an institution in Victoria that was church run and geared at getting young Chinese prostitutes off the street. But like many church run institutions of that time, the rescue home itself became a site of abuse. And that provided the inspiration for one of the main characters in my novel, Daisy, who's Kaya's best friend and is a biracial sex worker who's fleeing. So yeah, those are some of the research sources. Also, a lot of YouTube videos of other people's very adventurous trips trekking through this region. Because I was working on this novel during the pandemic years, I wasn't actually able to travel there myself, which in some ways I feel is unfortunate, but I'm not a very athletic person actually. So if I had gone there, I wouldn't have been, doing these sort of day-long treks. It would have been a much sort of tamer experience that I would have had as a tourist.
That's really fascinating about the family diary that you had access to, because I mean, I don't know if like a lot of men were diarists. I mean, I'm talking about sort of working class men. I think every family member would love something like that. That's incredible.
Yeah, during that period, there was sort of a tradition amongst Japanese immigrants to sort of keep some form of diary. I've heard about these diaries existing in other Japanese Canadian families.
Oh, okay. Sisters of the Spruce opens with a quote from Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and I'm going to actually quote it here. Quote, "We said there weren't no home like a raft after all. Other places do seem so cramped and smothery, but a raft don't. You feel mighty free and easy and comfortable on a raft," unquote. And later, main character Kaya convinces Daisy, who you mentioned, to go with her by sharing Huck's story. And I just wondered if you could talk about using Huck Finn as a backdrop to your novel.
One of my interests in writing this novel was to explore an adventurous journey through rugged landscapes written from the perspective of close female friendship, because I feel that often that type of story, it's reserved typically for male protagonists, like the story of Huck Finn or Robinson Crusoe, that kind of thing. Whereas novels about female friendship are very often focused more on courtship plots. So one of my aims in writing Sisters of the Spruce was to playfully experiment with and subvert these narrative conventions. So yes, as you mentioned, there's a famous scene in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn that my novel references when Huck fakes his own death to get away from his abusive, alcoholic, loud of a father. And this involves concocting quite a gory scene using pig's blood to make it look as though he's been bludgeoned to death and dragged off. So it's by referencing this scene that Kaya convinces Daisy it could be possible for her to flee the life that she's been condemned to and run away from her pimp, the man who's been holding her captive, as the two girls come up with a plan to fake Daisy's death, which is far less gory. It doesn't involve pig's blood, but it involves devising a suicide note and making it look like she's filled the pockets of her dress with rocks and walked out into the water. So it's more kind of a Virginia Woolf type of death, I suppose.
You said exactly what it was that I loved most about this novel. I'm kind of on this kick of just female empowerment, and I love that these characters are younger, they're female, they have a bond because, as you said, often it's related to courtship or even having combative relationships with other females. And so that's why I said your novel hit me at the exact right time because it's what I've been looking for. And you just articulated it so well that I think we need to hear more female friendship kind of stories. So I love that about it.
Oh, I'm so happy it resonated with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, because Kaya and Daisy's relationship is so central in this novel, it's so important. I just wondered if you can talk a little bit more without giving away too much, but a little bit more about their relationship because that's kind of the thing I loved is that they were young and they had completely different life paths, but then they connect and that relationship is just so beautiful.
Well, Daisy is she becomes Kaya's best friend and more than best friend towards the end of the novel. She's a half Chinese orphan who has been trafficked and condemned to a life in the sex trade. She's been brought out to this region by quite a despicable man known as Handsome Joe to service the logging population there. It's a predominantly male population, as you would expect out in this region. So while Kaya is digging for clams on the beach one day, she catches sight of this tawny haired girl running away from this large bearded man whom she's very clearly afraid of, and turns out to be her captor and pimp. And so she follows Daisy into the woods, and then they start engaging in conversation, which at first is quite halting because Daisy is very frightened and doesn't want to give too much away about her circumstances. She doesn't know yet whether she can trust Kaya. So it's over a period of time that the friendship evolves and they begin to tell each other their life stories. But from the very outset, I think Kaya feels this instinctive affinity for Daisy and this deep sympathy for her suffering. And she can really sort of sense that something's not right about these circumstances under which she's been forced to live. And then, yeah, without giving too much away, towards the end of the novel, their friendship verges on something more than friendship, I'll say. Here, I wanted to just sort of explore some sort of life for the girls removed from the existing social order of the novel, which is basically heterosexual marriage or a spinster daughter living under the thumb of her father as she gets older. And it's quite clear that neither of those options is going to work very well for Kaya, who is very much a tomboy, very opinionated, speaks her mind.
I love the evolution of their relationship because I love, like you said in the beginning, it's very halting. And then they see a future ultimately, as you just said, that isn't connected to the standard, whatever, what was expected of them at that time period. And just how you grow those two characters and that relationship is just masterful. I loved that so much. And like I told you before, I gush a lot, so I'm trying to like temper what I'm saying a little bit, but I
Oh,
love
it's
those two
music
characters.
to my ears. You don't have
Yeah.
to.
Well, it's like I said, it's two female characters that aren't even the standard because they go through this process together, sometimes apart and sometimes together. And I just love the nature of their relationship. So yes. Okay. I have to laugh because the question I'm about to ask you has a little bit of a backstory now because last night I watched an interview with Percival Everett, who just wrote the novel James, which is a retelling of Huckleberry Finn, the character Jim, the enslaved person Jim, but from James's point of view.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I've read some reviews of this novel and it really intrigues me. Yeah, I have to read it.
Yeah, you should read it. Tara and I read it. We absolutely loved it. But they asked him this question last night, and I'm not going to tell you what his answer is until after you say it, because I'm curious just to see what
Mhm.
you say, how you answer this question. But what do you hope readers take away from Sisters of the Spruce?
I don't think there's sort of one answer, but one of the things that comes to mind would have to do with sisterhood, because this is very much a novel about sisterhood, as the title indicates. And I think in my novels, sisterhood can take many different forms and quite diverse forms. There's, first of all, the relationship that Kaya has with her two biological sisters, Izzy, which is short for Izumi, and this is the sister that was raised in Japan and has only very recently rejoined the family. So that's quite a fraught relationship. And then there's also Kaya's younger sister, May, which is a more sort of harmonious relationship of sisterhood. And then there's also sisterhood in a more figurative sense, the bonds of close friendship that she forms with Daisy. And then there's also this other aspect of sisterhood that my novel explores at various points. And that's how women who are complete strangers can also engage in spontaneous acts of sisterhood. So, for instance, when Kaya and Daisy are off on their journey together, this perilous journey that they take in the second half of the novel, at one point they're being held captive by a man who's kidnapped them and is preparing to sell them to a brothel. And then a kitchen maid who sees what's happening takes sympathy on the girls and comes to their rescue, really putting her own safety and life on the line for them. So I think my novel also explores these instinctive bonds that women who are complete strangers can experience when pushed into dangerous circumstances.
You nailed it. To me, that is exactly what I took away from the novel. And I'm so glad you said that because I will just say, and this is no shade on, Percival Everett, but he basically sort of said, once I've written it, he said, readers make the meaning. I don't know. It's like once I'm done with it, I'm done with it. And I thought, wow, that was a little bit of a sad answer because I kind of like to know a little bit too about what really drives an author to tell a story. And I love your answer much better, although I still, no shade to Percival Everett. So, anyway, okay. I really hate to ask this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway because you've just finished Sisters of the Spruce. But are you currently working on anything for us to have in the future?
I'm currently working on another historical novel called The Breakwater, which is going to be published by Cormorant Books in a couple of years. I'm currently working on fairly substantial revisions. This is a novel inspired by my grandfather's relationship with a younger brother no one in our family knew existed because he'd been institutionalized at Essendale Asylum in BC as a young man.
That sounds fascinating. Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, I'll have time to read your other three, and then I'll be ready for the next one. That sounds perfect. My last question for you, if there's anything you're currently reading that you want to just mention, or anything that you've read that you've even more recently or a long time ago that you really love that you want to just let our readers know about.
Yes, I just finished reading a novel called We Measure the Earth with Our Bodies by a Tibetan Canadian author, Sring Yangzum Lama. And this is a really sweeping, moving family epic about the oppression and displacement of Tibetans, told through the story of two sisters, and then looks at the after effects of this historical period on subsequent generations. And I really felt that I learned a lot about Tibetan history, and then also the trafficking of stolen sacred objects, which kind of propels the mystery at the heart of the novel. And now I'm reading a memoir called Within the Barbed Wire Fence by Takeo Nakano, partly as research for my novel in progress. It's a memoir written by a Japanese Canadian author about his time during the Second World War, being interned at a prisoner of war camp in Angler, Ontario, for refusing to go to the internment camp in BC that he was assigned to because it differed from the camp where his wife and daughter were being sent. So he kind of ends up being labeled a troublemaker and gets sent to this POW camp instead. And the memoir combines his often lyrical reflections about the natural landscape in this really harsh environment with a series of haikus he was writing at the time.
Oh, wow. I've not even heard of it. The first one I know. I mean, I've heard of it and it's on my
Mhm.
reading list, but the second one, I've not even heard of this. So that one sounds really interesting.
Yeah, it is. It came out a number of years ago. I think it might have originally been published in 1980. Yeah, 1980.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to have to look into that one. Leslie, let me just say how much, again, I love Sisters of the Spruce. I'll be reading your other books. I want to encourage all of our listeners to pick up any or all of Leslie's books. And just thank you so much for joining me today. And I would love to have you back when the next novel comes out.
Thank you. That would be lovely. Thank you so much for this lively and interesting discussion.
Great. All right, everyone. Happy reading.
Thank you for joining us on our bookish journey. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing Canada Reads American Style wherever you listen. You can connect with the podcast and Rebecca on Instagram at Canada Reads American Style, and with Tara at On a Branch Reads. Until next time, keep reading.